Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. What I experienced at a remote rest area in the Tennessee mountains was one of those moments, a brush with something that shouldn't exist, yet undeniably did. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. I pride myself on knowing every truck stop, rest area, and safe haven between Atlanta and Pittsburgh. After 14 hours of navigating winding mountain roads through the Appalachian foothills, my body ached and my eyes burned from the strain. It looked like it had been there for hours, maybe days, with leaves scattered across its windshield and a thick layer of dust coating its faded blue paint. Perhaps it was the way it sat at an odd angle, as if it had been parked hastily, or the fact that it seemed completely empty yet somehow ominous. Breakdowns were common in these mountain areas where cell phone service was spotty. The trucking community was like a brotherhood. We looked out for each other because today's good deed might be tomorrow's lifeline. I'd learned to trust my instincts over the years, and right now they were screaming that something wasn't right. One of its doors hung slightly ajar, and dark stains covered the driver's seat that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I needed rest, and this isolated spot promised peace and quiet. I called out, my voice echoing off the surrounding hills. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. But on that October night, I discovered that some places on the map are better left unvisited. This wasn't a stranded motorist in need of assistance. This was something else entirely, something dangerous and unpredictable. I'd heard stories from other truckers about encounters with unstable individuals at remote rest stops, people who lived on the fringes of society and preyed on unsuspecting travelers. The pipe wrench was raised above his head like a medieval war hammer, and a sound escaped his throat that was part scream, part animal growl. His face, now visible in the light, was a mask of pure rage and madness, with wild eyes and bare teeth that looked more like fangs. The tool looked heavy and well-used, with dark stains along its metal surface that I didn't want to think about too closely. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps pounding against the gravel, accompanied by that inhuman howling that raised every hair on the back of my neck. The sound of the heavy wrench cutting through the air was audible even over my own labored breathing. I tried to start the engine, but my hands were shaking so badly I kept missing the ignition switch. As the truck lurched forward, I saw the man in my rearview mirror, still standing in the parking lot and watching me leave. Even as the distance increased, I could see that terrible figure silhouetted against the street light, motionless once again, but somehow even more menacing in his stillness. The dispatcher took my statement seriously and promised to send a patrol car to investigate. But I had a sinking feeling they wouldn't find anything. The sound of metal on metal was deafening, and I was certain he would eventually break through one of the windows. Every shadow on the roadside looked like a potential threat. Every oncoming vehicle could be the madman somehow following me. The rest area was eventually closed and the access road barricaded, but I knew that wouldn't stop someone like the man with the wrench. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, less trusting of isolated places that had once seemed peaceful and safe. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through remote areas, I catch a glimpse of a figure standing by the roadside, and my heart races with the memory of those cold, dead eyes. Predators like that simply moved on to new hunting grounds, new places where they could wait in the shadows. They had found the rest area exactly as I had described it, complete with the abandoned pickup truck and dents in the gravel where the struggle had taken place. But there was no sign of the man with the wrench. The most disturbing part wasn't the violence or the near-death experience. It was the realization that if I had arrived just 10 minutes earlier or later, because in the end, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in horror movies. They're the ones that look like ordinary people until the moment they reveal their true nature. I might never have seen the danger until it was too late, but his eyes, even from that distance, I could feel them boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way he stood, to still to patient, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Story 1. The Man with the Wrench. The officer explained that they had found evidence of a struggle inside the vehicle, including blood spatter that suggested foul play, but whoever was responsible had vanished. He was tall and gaunt, wearing dirty coveralls that hung loosely on his skeletal frame. I could feel the man gaining on me, could almost feel the cold metal of the wrench whizzing past my head. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging in greasy strands around a face I couldn't quite make out in the shadows. The investigation that followed would uncover the remains of 7 individuals, buried in shallow graves throughout the surrounding forest. Victims who had made the fatal mistake of stopping at the Mountain View Rest area. Through the window, I could see the man standing just outside, still holding the wrench and staring at me with those terrible eyes. He began pounding on the door with the tool, each blow sending vibrations through the entire cab and spider-webbing the safety glass. I felt something brush against my back, the wrench missing me by mere inches and striking the side of my truck with a resounding clang that echoed through the mountains. The impact left a significant dent in the metal paneling, testament to the incredible force behind the blow. He just continued to stare with those cold, dead eyes that seemed to reflect the street light like an animal's. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Some encounters change you forever. It was nestled between 2 steep ridges that blocked out most noise from the interstate below. The October air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and I could smell wood smoke drifting down from scattered cabins dotting the mountainside. I'm James, and I've been hauling freight for nearly 2 decades. The Mountain View Rest area wasn't on any official trucking guides. It was one of those hidden gems that veteran drivers whispered about on CB radio conversations. The rest area was frozen in time, with weathered picnic tables, rusted trash cans, and a single flickering street light that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. As I performed my routine post-drive inspection, I noticed another vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck sitting at the far end of the lot. Something about the abandoned truck made me uneasy. I decided to investigate, thinking perhaps someone needed help. Hello? Anyone need help? That's when I saw him, standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure that seemed to have materialized from the darkness itself. What caught my attention immediately was what he held in his right hand, a large pipe wrench, easily 2 feet long, that gleamed dully in the pale light. The man wasn't moving, just standing there like a scarecrow. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and friendly. "You having car trouble? I might be able to help." The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. Something deep in my gut told me to get back to my truck immediately. "Okay, well, if you don't need help, I'll just be heading back to my truck," I said, taking a slow step backward while keeping my eyes on the motionless figure. That's when he moved. Without warning, the figure suddenly lunged forward with a speed that seemed impossible for someone of his apparent age and condition. My military training kicked in, and I spun around and ran toward my truck with every ounce of speed I could muster. The distance to my truck seemed to stretch on forever, like something out of a nightmare where you run and run, but never seem to get any closer to safety. Just as I reached my cab and grabbed the door handle, I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the lock. The assault continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with the man circling the truck and striking it repeatedly while screaming incoherently. Finally, I managed to get the engine started and threw the transmission into gear. I drove non-stop for 50 miles, my heart pounding and my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally felt safe enough to stop at a well-lit truck stop, I called the Tennessee State Police to report the incident. 3 hours later, they called back with an update that chilled me to the bone. The truck was registered to a Harold Wickham, aged 67, who had been reported missing by his family 3 weeks ago. I realized with growing horror that I had likely encountered Harold Wickham's killer, someone who had been using the remote rest area as a hunting ground for unsuspecting travelers. The killer was never found, despite an extensive manhunt. That encounter changed me in ways that are hard to articulate. I learned that evil can take many forms, but the most terrifying is when it looks human while being something else entirely. The randomness of it all, the thin line between safety and horror, is what keeps me awake during those long nights on the road, and by then, it's usually too late to run. Story 2, the cargo that wasn't there. Sometimes the most disturbing cargo is the kind that isn't supposed to exist. What I hauled, or thought I hauled, from Phoenix to Sacramento still haunts my dreams 3 years later. I always prided myself on having a sixth sense about people and places that didn't feel right. That November night at the Moonlight Truck Plaza just outside Bakersfield, that sense was screaming at me, but exhaustion overruled caution, and I made a decision that would change everything. My name is Danny, and I've been trucking for 12 years. I found a spot near the back, away from the main building, but close enough to the security lights to feel relatively safe. Someone had been rubbing something on the side of my trailer. The substance looked like grease or oil, but it had an iridescent quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the artificial light. The marks formed a pattern that hurt my eyes to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves. Without breaking eye contact, he began walking toward me with a gait that was somehow both casual and predatory. His companion followed, and as she moved into the light, I saw that what I had mistaken for a coat was actually her skin, pale, translucent flesh that hung in loose folds around her emaciated frame. "We're just trying to help you out. Your rig's got some bad energy around it, and we're trying to cleanse it for you." At first glance, they appeared to be having a conversation, but something about their body language struck me as odd. They stood too close together, their movements too synchronized, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. "We just want to talk to you about your cargo. We know what you're really hauling, and we can help you dispose of it properly." His eyes never left my face as he performed this grotesque display, and I could hear him making soft, cooing sounds like a dove. But as the woman spoke, I began to remember strange details about the loading process that I dismissed at the time. The woman was using her fists, leaving bloody smears on the glass, while the man had produced what looked like a crowbar from somewhere in his jumpsuit. The sound of metal on glass was deafening in the confined space of the cab. The warehouse workers had been unusually secretive, covering the equipment with tarps and refusing to let me inspect the load. When I finally arrived at the delivery site, I was shocked to discover that my trailer was empty. The warehouse in Phoenix had been abandoned for months, according to local authorities, and the paperwork I had signed bore the names of people who didn't exist. The agricultural equipment that had been loaded in Phoenix was gone, leaving only strange burn marks on the trailer floor and the lingering smell of ozone and decay. The paperwork had been rushed, and the shipping company had paid me in cash rather than the usual electronic transfer. Entire families had vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty houses and fields that had been stripped bare of all vegetation. The woman and her companion hadn't been trying to rob me. They'd been trying to stop something far worse from reaching its destination, and I had delivered it right into the heart of California's agricultural region, where it could spread and multiply among the isolated farms and rural communities. They are the last line of defense against an invasion that most people will never see coming, fighting a war that will never make the evening news. Some loads are destined for things that live in the spaces between our world and others, creatures that use the trucking industry's vast network to spread their influence across the continent. But I know that my vigilance might not be enough, because the enemy has learned to hide in plain sight, using the very systems that keep society functioning to spread their corruption across the land. The reporter mentioned that witnesses had seen strange lights moving through the affected areas, accompanied by sounds that defied description. I hollered at the two figures. "What the hell are you doing to my truck? The cargo is alive, and it wants to come home." The trailer began to sway slightly, as if something large was moving around inside it. And hear sounds that remind me of that terrible night at the Moonlight Truck Plaza. I've learned to avoid certain routes, certain truck stops, and certain shipping companies that pay too well for jobs that seem too simple. The fog was rolling in thick, and the November air carried the distinctive Central California chill that cuts right through. "Your jacket!" The engine turned over on the third try, and I threw the transmission into gear without bothering to warm up the diesel. Her eyes had turned completely black, and I could see my own reflection multiplied dozens of times in their dark depths. Finally, she let go and tumbled into the darkness behind me, but her laughter followed the truck for miles down the highway. As the truck lurched forward, I saw the man lose his grip and fall to the asphalt, but the woman managed to hold on, her fingers somehow finding purchase on the smooth metal of the door frame. The truck stop was busier than usual for a Tuesday night, with at least a dozen big rigs scattered across the parking lot like sleeping giants. The woman had moved around to the passenger side and was now standing on my step, pressing her face against the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she smiled, revealing gums that were black with decay and teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. I'd never had to draw my weapon in all my years on the road, but I'd always known this day might come. But as I worked, I became increasingly aware that the two figures were watching me. Every time I glanced in their direction, they seemed to have moved slightly closer, though I never actually saw them walking. As I performed my post-trip inspection, I noticed two figures standing near the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden in the shadows cast by a broken street light. The first figure was a man in his 60s, wearing a stained mechanic's jumpsuit that had seen better days. His grey hair was slicked back with what looked like motor oil, and even from a distance, I could see the man's hands moving in strange, repetitive gestures. The second figure was harder to make out, shorter, wearing what appeared to be a long coat that hung loosely on a skeletal frame. I tried to ignore them, focusing on checking my trailer connections and securing my load. When I finished my inspection and walked around to the driver's side of my cab, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The smell was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with ozone and something else that reminded me of my grandmother's basement after it flooded. "Hey!" The man in the jumpsuit looked up and smiled, revealing teeth that were far too white and far too sharp for any human mouth. I backed toward my cab, my hand instinctively moving to the pistol I kept in my door panel. "Now hold on there, friend," the man called out, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. I climbed into my cab and locked the door, but I could see both figures approaching in my mirrors. The man jumped up on the driver's side step and began licking the window with a tongue that was far too long and covered in what looked like small barbs. "Open up, driver," the woman said, her voice muffled by the glass. My cargo manifest listed agricultural equipment, tractors, plows, and irrigation systems bound for farms in the Central Valley. The truck began to rock as both figures started pounding on the windows with increasing intensity. "Let us in," the man screamed, his voice rising to an inhuman pitch. "We know you can hear them calling." As if summoned by his words, I began to hear sounds coming from my trailer, scratching, scraping noises like fingernails on metal, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. She rode alongside the cab for nearly a quarter mile, her face pressed against the passenger window and her mouth moving in what looked like a silent chant. I drove without stopping until I reached Sacramento, my heart pounding and my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold night air. The shipping company claimed no knowledge of the missing cargo, and the insurance investigation turned up nothing. I was left with an empty trailer, a damaged truck, and memories that no one would believe. But the most disturbing part came weeks later when I was watching the evening news and saw a report about a series of disappearances in small farming communities throughout the Central Valley. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I had been hauling that night was connected to these disappearances. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through farming areas, I see lights moving through the fields because I know now that not all cargo is what it appears to be, and not all deliveries are meant for human recipients. And somewhere out there, the woman with the translucent skin and her companion are still waiting, still trying to intercept shipments that should never reach their destinations. I never took another cash job after that night, and I always inspect my cargo personally before leaving the loading dock. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the things that use it to travel between worlds. Story 3, The Body in the Road. I've been hauling lumber through the Montana wilderness for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these remote highways could throw at me. wildlife, weather, the occasional drunk driver weaving home from some forgotten bar. But what I encountered on that September night challenged everything I believed about the natural world. The stretch of highway I was traveling is particularly desolate. 30 miles of asphalt cutting through dense pine forests, and rolling meadows with no towns, no gas stations, and no cell phone coverage. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but as my headlights illuminated the object more clearly, I realized it was something far more disturbing. The night air was cold and still, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else, a metallic smell that reminded me of blood. It's the kind of road where you can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, where the silence is so complete it seems to press against your eardrums. I was about 15 miles from the nearest town when I saw something in the road ahead. That made me ease off the accelerator. The figure was lying face down in an unnatural position, arms and legs splayed at odd angles that suggested either severe injury or death. The figure was definitely human, but something about the proportions seemed off. The sickly sweet odor of advanced decomposition mixed with chemicals that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. The body had been there for days, maybe weeks, but somehow it looked fresh, as if death had occurred only hours ago. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the road, but the body was exactly where I'd left it. The torso was too long, the limbs too thin, and the head was positioned at an angle that should have been impossible for a living person. There's something wrong here, something really wrong. I'd heard stories from other truckers about bodies being used as bait to stop vehicles, allowing criminals to rob or carjack unsuspecting drivers. The figure was moving, not like a living person trying to get up, but like something being dragged or manipulated by an unseen force. The features were wrong, too sharp, too angular, with eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal's. The mouth was open in what might have been a scream, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that belonged in the mouth of a deep-sea predator. The limbs twitched and jerked in unnatural ways, and the head began to turn slowly toward my truck, first pushing itself up on its arms, then rising to its feet with a fluid grace that defied the laws of anatomy. In my mirrors, I could see the creature watching me leave, standing motionless in the middle of the highway like a scarecrow. It didn't run or walk. It simply appeared closer to my truck with each glance in the mirror, covering impossible distances in the blink of an eye, just as I thought my engine was about to seize. I crested a hill and saw the lights of a small town spread out in the valley below. The creature moved with a stuttering, stop-motion quality, like frames missing from an old film reel, but kept me on busier roads with more traffic and better cell phone coverage. Truckers across the country had reported encounters with bodies in the road. That turned out to be something else entirely. Things that used human appearance as camouflage to lure unsuspecting drivers into stopping. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, still using the isolated highways to hunt for victims. They understood human psychology well enough to know that most people would stop to help what appeared to be an injured person, and they exploited that compassion to get close to their prey. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its limbs elongated and twisted, its head cocked at an impossible angle as it studied my truck with those terrible glowing eyes. Some truckers listened, but most dismissed my warnings as the ravings of a man who'd spent too many years on the road. But this felt different, more calculated, more sinister than a simple highway robbery. Somewhere in the darkness between cities, things are waiting that defy explanation and challenge everything we thought we knew about the world. No body, no evidence of any kind of disturbance, just empty highway stretching through the forest. I ran back to my cab and climbed inside, locking the doors and grabbing my CB radio. Even though I knew I was in a dead zone, I tried calling for help anyway. When I finally worked up the courage to call the local sheriff's department, they sent a deputy to take my statement. But the officer clearly thought I was either drunk or suffering from hallucinations brought on by too many hours on the road. The person appeared to be wearing dark clothing, but it was difficult to make out details in the harsh glare of my headlights. There, sprawled across both lanes of the highway, was what appeared to be a human body. I was completely alone with whatever was happening outside my truck. My military training kicked in, and I began scanning the area for potential threats while simultaneously slowing my rig. I brought my truck to a complete stop about 50 feet from the body, leaving my engine running and my headlights trained on the scene. "Hello," I called out as I approached with my flashlight. "Are you okay?" The closer I got, the more wrong everything seemed. The body was positioned perfectly to deliberately, as if someone had carefully arranged it for maximum visual impact. The limbs were spread in a pattern that almost looked ritualistic, and there were no skid marks on the road to suggest a vehicle accident. "Do you need help?" There was no response, no movement, no sign of life. Most disturbing of all, I couldn't see any blood despite the fact that the person appeared to have suffered massive trauma. When I was about 10 feet away, I stopped and played my flashlight beam over the entire scene. That's when I noticed the smell, not blood after all, but something far worse. I backed away from the scene, my instinct screaming that this was a trap. As I retreated toward my truck, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, a wet, sliding noise like something large moving across the asphalt. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. "Mayday! Mayday! This is eastbound on Highway 100, mile marker 47. I've got a possible fatality in the roadway and I need immediate assistance." The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. I looked back at the body and saw something that made me question my sanity. When the face came into view, I saw that it wasn't human at all. The thing that had been masquerading as a human corpse began to move with increasing coordination. I threw my transmission into gear and floored the accelerator, my truck lurching forward as the diesel engine roared to life. But as the distance increased, I realized with growing horror that the thing was following me. The chase continued for miles, with the creature maintaining its impossible pursuit while I pushed my truck to its mechanical limits. As soon as my truck crossed the town limits, the creature vanished. I sat in the parking lot of an all-night diner for nearly an hour, shaking and trying to process what had happened. The next day, I drove back to mile marker 47 with a state trooper, but we found nothing. I never drove that stretch of highway again, choosing instead to take a longer route that added 2 hours to my trip. Over the following months, I began researching similar incidents and found a disturbing pattern. The creatures were real, and they were using America's highway system as their hunting ground. I started carrying more weapons and warning other drivers about the dangers of stopping for bodies in the road, especially on isolated highways where help was far away. But I know the truth, and I carry that knowledge with me every time I climb into my cab. The road is full of dangers that no driving manual could prepare you for, and the most terrifying ones are the ones that look like they need help. Story 4. The truck that wasn't a truck. I need to share something that happened to me on a February night in Wyoming. It's been 2 years now, and I still wake up some nights hearing Sarah's voice through the static, calling for help that never came. I was hauling industrial machinery from Detroit to Seattle, taking the northern route through Wyoming's endless plains. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, the kind of cold that could kill you in minutes if your truck broke down in the wrong place. If anyone can hear this, please call the police. Please. I'd been driving this route for 23 years, and I'd learned to respect the power of winter weather in the mountain states. It was nearly 2 a.m. when my CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that made me sit up straighter. "What's your location and what kind of help do you need?" The voice was female, young, and filled with terror that cut through the static like a knife. I pressed the accelerator, pushing my truck faster than was safe on the icy highway while trying to maintain radio contact. "Please, somebody help me. I am trapped in a truck at mile marker 135. Yes, coming back, and I don't think I can hide much longer." I'd heard stories from other truckers about drivers who weren't quite right. People who used the anonymity of the highway to prey on vulnerable hitchhikers. But the detail about the black eyes was something new. Something that suggested this situation was far worse than a simple predator. The display showed no signal, which was impossible. Satellite phones were designed to work anywhere on Earth. I tried again with the same result, then switched to my CB radio to call for help from other truckers. He's not normal. I managed to lock myself in the sleeper compartment, but he knows I'm in here. I'm going to be there in about 10 minutes. I grabbed my microphone and responded immediately. This is eastbound on I-80. I copy your transmission. The radio fell silent for several long seconds. I can see its shadow through the curtain, and it's too tall, too thin. And the smell. It smells like burning copper and rotting meat. I'd never had to use it, but I'd always known this day might come. The sounds were unlike anything I'd ever heard, mechanical yet organic, as if the truck itself was being transformed by some impossible force. It's alive somehow, and it's hungry. I can feel it trying to get inside my head, trying to make me open the door. The cab stretched and elongated, taking on an organic quality that made my stomach turn. The headlights pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, and the diesel engine's rumble had become something closer to a growl. What had appeared to be chrome exhaust stacks were now arriving like tentacles, and the windshield had become a cluster of black eyes that reflected my headlights. With malevolent intelligence, I can see the truck. I'm coming to get you out. It appeared to be a normal semi-truck, complete with a human driver, allowing it to pick up hitchhikers and stranded motorists without arousing suspicion. I got a female in distress at market 135, requesting immediate assistance from any units in the area. The tentacles stretched and elongated but finally snapped under the stress, allowing me to break free. Cables and wires hung from its underside like intestines, sparking and twitching with electrical current. Its surface was covered in what looked like license plates from dozens of different states, trophies from previous victims. In my mirrors, I could see the creature writhing in what might have been pain or rage, its disguise completely abandoned. He's back. He's trying to get into the sleeper. When the state police arrived at mile marker 135, they found nothing. No truck, no evidence of any disturbance, just empty highway stretching through the Wyoming wilderness. Oh God, he's not using the door handle. He's doing something to the metal. It's bending like it's made of clay, and inside its body the voices of previous prey echo through the static, calling for help that will never come. The creature was intelligent, adaptable, and patient. It could wait years between hunts, perfecting its camouflage and studying human behavior. Tentacles shot out from its body, wrapping around my front bumper and trying to drag me closer to that terrible mouth. Then the woman's voice returned, even more frightened than before. The walls are getting softer, and I can feel them pressing in on me. Michael, I don't think this is a truck at all. I think it's something that looks like a truck to full people. It was as if every communication device in my truck had suddenly stopped working, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. Is there a weapon in the sleeper you can use? Its transformation was accelerating, with more tentacles emerging from what had been the trailer and bioluminescent patterns appearing along its sides. I don't know exactly where I am. I was hitchhiking and this trucker picked me up, but something's wrong with him. As I got closer, I could see that it matched Sarah's description, a blue Peterbilt with flame decals. But something was wrong with the truck's appearance. The metal seemed to be moving, rippling like water, and the flames painted on the sides appeared to be actually burning. I checked my GPS and saw that mile marker at 135 was still 15 miles ahead. What's your name, miss? The driver said his name was Carl, but when I looked at his logbook, it had a different name. And his eyes, God, his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just black. I'm Michael, and I'm heading your way right now. Can you describe the truck you're in? My name is Sarah. It's a blue Peterbilt with flames painted on the sides. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. Sarah, I need you to stay calm and keep that door locked. I reached for my satellite phone to call 911, but the call wouldn't go through. Breaker, breaker. This is eastbound I-80 at mile marker at 120. The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. Sarah's voice returned, more panicked than before. I could hear sounds in the background of Sarah's transmission, a low humming noise like an electrical transformer, accompanied by what sounded like metal being twisted and reshaped. Sarah, can you see anything? There's a crowbar under the bunk, but I don't think it would help. Michael, this thing isn't human. I crested a hill and saw lights ahead. A truck parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. I pulled my truck to a stop about 100 yards away and grabbed my shotgun from behind my seat. "Sarah, I'm here." No. Sarah's voice screamed through the radio. "Don't come closer. It's not just the driver. The whole truck is wrong." As I watched, the blue Peterbilt began to change more dramatically. The thing that had been masquerading as a truck turned toward my position, and I could see that the grille had transformed into a mouth filled with rows of metallic teeth. "Sarah, where are you in that thing? I need to know exactly where you are." "I'm in the sleeper compartment, but it's changing too." I realized with growing horror that Sarah was right. The creature had evolved the perfect camouflage for hunting on America's highways. The creature began moving toward my truck, not rolling on wheels, but flowing across the asphalt like a massive slug. I threw my truck into reverse and began backing away. But the creature was faster than it looked. I floored the accelerator, my truck's engine straining against the creature's grip. The thing was enormous, easily the size of a city bus, with a body that seemed to be part machine and part organic tissue. I drove for 20 miles before my communication equipment started working again, and I immediately called 911. The dispatcher was skeptical but agreed to send a patrol car to investigate. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that Sarah was still out there somewhere, trapped inside a creature that used the highway system as its hunting ground. Somewhere on America's highways, a truck that isn't really a truck continues to prowl the darkness, searching for its next victim. Story 5. The Midnight Convoy. There are some invitations you should never accept, especially when they come from strangers on isolated highways. I learned this lesson the hard way during what should have been a routine drive through the Nevada desert. I knew every truck stop between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City, every speed trap, every shortcut through the desert, and rest before venturing into the most desolate stretch of highway in the American West. I'd been driving for 11 straight hours, hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, and my body ached from the constant vibration of the road. The driver parked near the building and walked inside, moving with the slightly stiff gait of someone who'd been sitting behind the wheel for too many hours. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The building looked like it had been constructed in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since, with faded paint, rusted metal siding, and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. The man's eyes were too bright, too intense, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed too white and too sharp. "It gives me time to think about my work." The man extended his hand in greeting, and I noticed that his fingers were unusually long and pale, with nails that looked more like claws. When he spoke, his voice had a quality that reminded me of fingernails on a chalkboard. But that night at Murphy's last stop changed everything I thought I knew about the people who share these roads. I approached and nodded in greeting, following the unwritten code of the road. More disturbing was the texture. The man's palm felt rough and scaly, like the hide of some reptilian creature. Carl spoke in riddles and half-statements, always seeming to imply more than he actually said. "That one's been coming in here for months, always alone, always asking questions about other drivers. Something ain't right about him." The cashier, whose name tag identified her as Dolores, rang up my purchase with mechanical efficiency. Let's just say I transport things that most people wouldn't want to know about. Sure, I guess that would be okay. "I'm on channel 19. Why don't we convoy for a while? Keep each other company on the CB. You never know what kind of dangers you might encounter out there in the dark." Specialized items for specialized clients. The kind of work that pays very well if you have the stomach for it. He mentioned having cargo that required special handling, and talked about making deliveries to people who were very particular about their requirements. "This is your new road buddy, Carl. Beautiful night for driving, isn't it? I'm always looking for new partners, people who understand the value of discretion. Let's just say I transport items that are very much in demand, but difficult to obtain through conventional channels. Rare specimens, you might say. Things that most people have never seen and hopefully never will. The kind of work I do requires a special type of person, someone who can keep secrets. So peaceful, so quiet, perfect for getting to know each other better. I'm Tommy, and I'd been driving these southern routes for 15 years. The CB radio crackled to life. Murphy's last stop was exactly what its name suggested. A final opportunity for fuel. Food. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:47 a.m. as I pulled into the diesel bay. I tried to keep my responses vague, but Carl was persistent, always probing for more details. As I filled my tanks, I noticed another truck pulling into the lot. A newer Peterbilt with California plates. The interior was a time capsule from a bygone era, with wood-paneled walls, vinyl boots that had seen better decades, and a jukebox that probably still played 45 RPM records. I finished fueling and decided to go inside for coffee and maybe strike up a conversation with a fellow road warrior. The other trucker was standing at the coffee station, filling a large styrofoam cup with what looked like motor oil. "Long night?" I asked, reaching for my own cup. The other driver looked up and smiled, but something about his expression made my skin crawl. "Every night's a long night out here," he replied, "but I don't mind. I enjoy the solitude, the darkness." There was something in the way he said work that made me uncomfortable, as if the word carried implications that went far beyond simple freight hauling. "Name's Carl," he said. "Carl Wickham. I've been driving these roads for more years than I care to count." I shook the offered hand and immediately regretted it. Carl's skin was ice-cold despite the warm interior of the truck stop, and his grip was uncomfortably strong. The conversation continued for several minutes, but I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. When I asked what kind of freight Carl hauled, the man's eyes took on a predatory gleam. I excused myself and walked to the counter to pay for my coffee, but I could feel Carl's eyes following me across the room. "You be careful out there, honey," Dolores said quietly, glancing toward Carl. I nodded and headed for the door, but Carl intercepted me near the exit. "Hey, Tommy," I was thinking, "we're both heading north and the road can get pretty lonely." Every instinct the first possessed was screaming at me to refuse, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Carl's smile became even more unsettling. "Perfect. I'll be right behind you, watching your back." As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Carl's headlights appear in my mirrors, following at a distance that was close enough to be threatening, but far enough away to seem coincidental. "Hey there, Tommy boy." The conversation continued for the next hour, with Carl asking increasingly personal questions about my family, my home address, my usual routes and schedules. "You know, Tommy, I've been thinking about expanding my business operations." My unease was growing by the mile. "What exactly do you haul, Carl? You keep talking about specialized cargo, but you never say what it is." Carl's laughter came through the radio like the sound of breaking glass. The highway stretched ahead through the Nevada desert, empty and desolate under a canopy of stars. I realized that I was completely alone with this strange man, miles from the nearest town. "With no cell phone coverage, you seem nervous, Tommy. Your driving's getting a little erratic. Maybe you should pull over and take a break. I know a perfect spot just ahead, very private, very secluded. We could have a face-to-face conversation, really get to know each other, and no way to call for help if the situation went bad." Carl's truck continued to follow at the same distance, its headlights like predatory eyes in my mirrors. "There's a rest area at mile marker 127. You're going to pull over there, and we're going to have a little chat about your future." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm fine, thanks." They weren't human at all, but something that might have been human once before being transformed into something else entirely. "This is eastbound I-80 at mile marker 130. I'm being pursued by hostile individuals. Request immediate assistance." Their bodies were elongated and twisted, with too many joints in their limbs and faces that looked like they'd been melted and reformed. "I want to make some more miles before I stop. We know where you live, where your family lives. We know your routes, your schedules, your habits. You're going to stop eventually, and when you do, we'll be waiting." My truck seemed to be steering itself toward the exit ramp, as if my hands were no longer under my own control. I watched in my mirrors as the vehicle skidded sideways across the median, nearly rolling over before coming to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. Carl and his companions had been stalking me, studying my patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. I drove at maximum speed back toward Murphy's last stop, hoping to find help or at least other people who could witness what was happening. The lights were off, the doors were locked, and there was no sign of Dolores or anyone else. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City that my phone finally picked up a signal and I was able to call 911. Carl and his companions were too smart, too organized to leave evidence behind. I started varying my routes, avoiding the Nevada desert entirely, and carrying more weapons in my truck. It was as if the entire place had been evacuated in preparation for whatever Carl had planned. The meeting at Murphy's last stop hadn't been coincidental, it had been carefully orchestrated. Still searching for the next traveler who will make the mistake of accepting an invitation from a stranger in the darkness. With tremendous effort, I managed to keep my truck on the highway, but the struggle left me exhausted and shaking. "Oh, but I insist," Carl replied, and now his voice had taken on a commanding tone that seemed to bypass my conscious mind. There were figures moving around inside, shadowy shapes that didn't look entirely human, preparing something that I instinctively knew I didn't want to see up close. The highway was elevated here, running along a ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides. They understood the culture of the road well enough to blend in, to appear normal until they revealed their true nature. There were no exit ramps, no side roads, nowhere to go except forward into whatever trap Carl had prepared. Despite every rational thought telling me not to, I found myself slowing down as I approached mile marker 127. Carl's truck shot past me, and I could see the creatures inside scrambling to adjust their positions. I waited until Carl's truck was committed to a passing maneuver, then suddenly cut across the median and began heading back the way I'd come. I immediately floored the accelerator and began weaving back and forth across both lanes, making it difficult for Carl to match my movements. I fought against the compulsion, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I was hoping we could do this the easy way, but you're going to make me work for it. Behind me, Carl's truck had moved closer, and I could see that the other driver was no longer alone in his cab. Through the passenger window, I could see Carl behind the wheel, but the man's appearance had changed dramatically. His skin had taken on a greyish, mottled appearance, and his eyes now glowed with an inner light that was definitely not human. "That wasn't very cooperative, Tommy," Carl's voice said, and now it sounded different, deeper, more resonant. Carl's truck suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside my rig in the left lane. The figures in Carl's passenger seat were now clearly visible, and my mind recoiled from what I was seeing. I grabbed my CB microphone and began broadcasting on the emergency channel. "Mayday, mayday." The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. It was as if Carl and his companions were somehow jamming all communication frequencies. "You can't run forever, Tommy," Carl's voice said, now coming through the radio with a quality that made the speakers vibrate. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random encounter. In desperation, I began looking for any possible escape route. I suddenly hit my brakes, causing my truck to decelerate rapidly. Finally, I saw what I'd been looking for, an emergency crossover in the highway median. Carl's truck tried to follow, but its larger size and the presence of the creatures inside made it less maneuverable. I didn't stop to see if Carl and his companions were injured, but when I arrived at the truck stop, I found it completely abandoned. I continued driving east, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the site of the encounter. The dispatcher took my report seriously and promised to send patrol cars to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. I completed my delivery in Salt Lake City, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The creatures were real, and they were using the trucking industry's vast network to hunt for victims. Somewhere out there in another forgotten truck stop or abandoned rest area, I'm certain that Carl is still waiting, still holding whatever instruments his companions had prepared. Story 6, The Shoulder Walkers. Some things you see on the highway stay with you forever. The figures I encountered on Interstate 75 that August night have haunted my dreams for years. and I still don't fully understand what I witnessed. I'm Marcus, and I've been driving truck for 19 years. I thought I knew every type of hazard these southeastern highways could throw at me, from hurricane-force winds to impaired drivers to the occasional wildlife encounter. But nothing prepared me for what I saw walking along the shoulder that humid Georgia evening. It was 2:15 a.m., and the heat hadn't broken even after sunset. The asphalt still radiated warmth from the day's brutal sun, creating shimmering mirages that danced in my headlights. None of them ever looked at approaching vehicles or attempted to flag down help. They walked with their heads held high, staring straight ahead with expressions of serene contentment. That seemed completely inappropriate for people wandering a dangerous highway in the middle of the night. As I'd slowed my truck and pulled toward the shoulder, the woman had turned to look directly at me. Her face was pale and waxy, with eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal's. She'd smiled, revealing teeth that were to white and to perfect, and raised one bony hand in what might have been a greeting or a summons. Breaker 19. This is southbound I-75 at mile marker 42. Anyone else seeing pedestrians on the shoulder tonight? I was hauling furniture from Atlanta to Miami, a routine run I'd made dozens of times. In my mirrors, I'd watched the woman return to her measured walk as if the encounter had never happened. They appeared at regular intervals, roughly every 2 or 3 miles, as if they were following some predetermined route. For the past 50 miles, I'd been seeing figures walking along the highway shoulder. Same clothes, same walk, same everything. Either there's a whole bunch of identical people out here, or something ain't right with what we're seeing. About 5 miles up the road, my headlights illuminated a man in his 40s wearing a business suit that looked expensive, but was now stained and torn. At first, I dismissed them as hitchhikers or stranded motorists. Hey, buddy, you need a ride. It's not safe to be walking out here. The figure's face was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. But I have somewhere I need to be. We all do. His mouth was set in a slight smile that never wavered, and his eyes held an emptiness that suggested no one was home behind them. What kind of work? Strangest damn thing I ever witnessed. People like you, who stop to help strangers in the night. People who ask too many questions. They just keep walking, no matter what. They appeared to be people of all ages, elderly men in hospital gowns, middle-aged women in blue dresses, children in pajamas, teenagers in school uniforms. How do you know my name? What do you want from me? Counted over 40 so far, all heading the same direction. The walking is just the beginning. A way to sort out those who are ready from those who aren't. You've shown curiosity, compassion, the willingness to help strangers. These are valuable qualities in our line of work. His smile revealed teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. In my mirrors, I could see the man standing motionless on the shoulder, watching me drive away with those terrible glowing eyes. Tried to stop and help one of them, little girl in a nightgown, but she just looked right through me. You can't outrun us, Marcus. We know your name, your route, your destination. We've been watching you for a long time, waiting for the right moment to extend our invitation. She reminded me of my late grandmother, and my first instinct had been to stop and offer assistance. According to his account, the walkers had simply walked into the darkened building and disappeared, as if the walls were permeable to their passage. But as the sightings became more frequent, I began to notice disturbing patterns that defied logical explanation. Anyone know where they're going or where they're coming from? The figures all walked in the same direction, moving north against the flow of traffic with a purposeful, measured gait that never varied. But they all shared certain characteristics that made my skin crawl. Most disturbing of all, they cast no shadows despite the bright illumination from my headlights. I'd encountered my first shoulder walker about an hour earlier, an elderly woman in a faded hospital gown shuffling along the gravel shoulder near Valdosta. But something about the woman's posture and movement had triggered my survival instincts. I'd accelerated past her, my heart pounding with inexplicable terror. Since then, I'd counted at least 24 more shoulder walkers, all moving north with the same purposeful stride, all wearing that same serene expression. I pulled over to the shoulder with my hazard lights flashing and grabbed my CB radio. Switching to channel 19, the radio crackled with static before a gravelly voice responded. Yeah, I copied that. Driver. Been seeing them for the past 100 miles. Another voice joined the conversation. This is northbound at marker 67. I've been tracking these people for 2 hours now. I keep my microphone. Negative on that. Good buddy. But I'll tell you what has really got me spooked. I passed the same old man 3 times tonight. One driver claimed to have followed a group of shoulder walkers to their apparent destination, an abandoned rest area that had been closed for renovations. I decided to conduct my own investigation. I started my engine and began driving slowly northward, keeping my eyes peeled for the next figure. I pulled alongside the walking figure and rolled down my passenger window. The man turned to look at me, and I immediately regretted my decision to stop. Thank you for your concern, the man said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Where are you going? I asked, though every instinct was telling me to drive away. The man's smile widened slightly. North, always north, to the place where the walking ends and the real work begins. I felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. The kind that requires fresh volunteers, the man replied, and now his voice carried an undertone that made my teeth ache. The man's eyes began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light, and I could see that his pupils had elongated into vertical slits. I floored the accelerator, my truck lurching forward as I fled from the encounter. The CB radio crackled to life with a voice I recognized as the businessman's. Though he was now several miles away, I grabbed my microphone with shaking hands. We want you to join us, Marcus, to become part of something larger than yourself. What line of work? I demanded. Recruitment, the voice replied. We're always looking for new team members, people who understand the importance of helping others find their true purpose. They were recruiters, agents of some larger organization that used the highway system to identify and collect potential members. The walking was a form of psychological testing, designed to attract people who would stop to help strangers in distress. The shoulder is just our interview process, a way to identify candidates who have the right disposition. I realized with dawning horror that the shoulder walkers weren't victims or lost souls. No more loneliness on the long hauls, just the satisfaction of meaningful work and the companionship of like-minded individuals. What happens to people who join you? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Up close, the figure's inhuman nature was even more apparent. His skin had a translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath the surface, and his movements were too fluid, too graceful for normal human anatomy. They all wore the same peaceful expression, the same empty smile that suggested they'd found something they'd been searching for their entire lives. As I got closer, I realized it was a massive gathering of shoulder walkers, hundreds of figures standing in perfect formation across both lanes of the interstate, blocking all traffic in both directions. In the beginning of your real purpose, step out of the truck and let us show you what you've been missing all these years on the road. They find peace, the voice replied. No more worries about deadlines, fuel costs, or mechanical breakdowns. In my mirrors, I could see the entire gathering pursuing me, moving as a single organism. Across the highway, I could see other vehicles scattered among the walkers, cars, trucks, and motorcycles that had apparently been stopped by previous gatherings. I continued driving south until I reached the Florida border, where I finally felt safe enough to stop and call for help. You're only delaying the inevitable. Marcus, we have agents throughout the highway system. Every truck stop, every rest area. You can't drive forever. The Georgia State Police had no record of any unusual activity on I-75, and the trucking company's dispatcher insisted that all drivers were accounted for and operating normally. I started traveling in convoys with other truckers, and I always carried multiple forms of communication. The shoulder walkers were still out there, still recruiting, still adding to their ranks, one compassionate driver at a time. Most importantly, I never stopped to help strangers. Walking along the highway shoulder, no matter how much my conscience urged me to do so. The idea of joining a community where all of those worries would disappear was incredibly appealing. I had always been independent, always valued my freedom above security or comfort. The thought of surrendering my will to some collective consciousness filled me with revulsion. Some of the vehicle's drivers were now standing among the walkers. Having apparently joined their ranks, the shoulder walkers immediately began moving toward me, their serene expressions never changing but their pace increasing dramatically. I looked in my mirrors and saw that the shoulder walkers were now appearing in greater numbers, emerging from the tree line on both sides of the highway. They moved with increasing coordination, forming loose groups that seemed to be herding my truck towards some predetermined destination. All of them were facing my approaching truck, and all of them wore the same serene smile. Their eyes glowed with that same phosphorescent light, creating a constellation of unblinking stars in the darkness. Ahead of me, the highway curved to the right, and I could see lights in the distance that didn't look like normal traffic. They stood with military precision, arranged in rows that stretched from the median to the outer shoulders. I brought my truck to a stop about 50 yards from the assembled crowd. The businessman appeared at my driver's side window, though I hadn't seen him approach. "Welcome to the end of your journey, Marcus," the businessman said. I looked at the assembled crowd and realized that many of the faces were familiar. Truckers I'd known for years, drivers who had simply vanished from the CB channels without explanation. The temptation was overwhelming. I was tired of the loneliness, tired of the endless miles and the constant pressure to make deliveries on time. But something deep in my core rebelled against the offer. Instead of opening my door, I threw my truck into reverse and began backing away from the gathering. I spun my truck around in a dangerous U-turn and began driving south, back the way I'd come. The chase continued for miles, with the shoulder walkers maintaining their pursuit while the businessman's voice provided commentary through the CB radio. As dawn began to break over the Georgia landscape, the shoulder walkers gradually fell behind and disappeared, as if daylight somehow weakened their ability to maintain the pursuit. But when I tried to report the incident to the authorities, I found that no one would believe my story. From that night forward, I never drove alone on isolated highways after dark, because I had learned that sometimes the people who appear to need help the most are actually the ones you should fear the most.